Are US HR policies valid in Canada? Why US HR policies do not automatically transfer? A lot of US companies assume that if their HR policies are solid at home, they can just roll them out in Canada with minimal tweaks. That is where trouble starts. Canadian employment law is built on different assumptions, and several core ideas that sit quietly in US policies simply do not exist the same way in Canada. The most important one is at-will employment. In the United States, many policies and handbooks assume the company can end employment at almost any time, for almost any non-discriminatory reason, with little or no notice. In Canada, that foundation is missing. You cannot sweep it back in through policy language. If your handbook is full of at-will disclaimers and carefully crafted US legal phrasing, those passages will not magically control Canadian employment relationships. Termination, notice, and severance expectations. In Canada, employees are entitled to notice of termination or pay in lieu and sometimes additional severance when they are dismissed without cause. That entitlement comes from a mix of employment standards statutes and judge-made law. A termination section copied from a US handbook that says employment may be terminated at any time without notice simply will not hold up. Even if a Canadian employee signs that document, courts are going to look at whether the contract respects minimum standards and basic fairness rules. If it doesn't, they ignore that part and apply Canadian law instead. Practically, that means any HR policy or contract you use in Canada needs to assume that termination has a cost and that this cost grows with length of service and seniority. Employment standards, vacation, overtime, and holidays. Every Canadian province has its own employment standards legislation. Those statutes set minimum rules for vacation time, vacation pay, overtime triggers and rates, public holidays, minimum wage, rest periods, and several other working conditions issues. Your HR policies are only valid in Canada if they at least meet those floors. Offering 10 days of PTO for everyone might sound generous in a US context, but could fall below legal minimum vacation entitlements once Canadian service thresholds are reached. The same goes for overtime. Many US policies assume broad exempt categories. In Canada, being salaried is not enough to avoid overtime rules. If your overtime policy ignores provincial thresholds and premium rates, it will not be considered valid, regardless of what your US lawyer wrote. Privacy, monitoring, and harassment policies. Canadian privacy rules around employee data are generally tighter than what many US employers are used to. Policies that talk about broad rights to monitor email, devices, and personal information need to be rewritten with Canadian standards in mind. Employees are entitled to know what data is collected, why it is collected, how it is used, and how long it is kept. They also have a reasonable expectation of privacy in certain contexts, even when using company systems. Harassment and workplace violence rules are also more prescriptive in many provinces. It is not enough to have a two-line anti-harassment statement buried in a handbook. You may be required to have a standalone policy, a clear complaint process, and periodic training. A US policy that is light on process will not meet those expectations. Leaves, accommodation, and human rights constraints. Leaves of absence and accommodation obligations are another area where US policies can break down. Canada has its own mix of job-protected leaves for illness, family responsibilities, pregnancy and parental leave, and other situations. Your policies have to be aligned with those rights, even when your US playbook is built around different triggers, durations, and benefit structures. On top of that, human rights codes in each province restrict decisions based on protected grounds such as disability, family status, and religion. A US attendance or discipline policy that does not leave room for accommodation can clash with those rules if it is applied rigidly to Canadian staff. Using a global framework with Canadian overlays. The good news is you do not need to abandon your global culture or completely rewrite every HR policy from scratch. A workable approach is to keep a global HR framework that sets values, behavior expectations, and general processes, and then bolt on Canadian-specific overlays wherever law matters. For example, your global code of conduct can apply everywhere, but your Canadian annex explains how local law treats harassment, overtime, vacation, and termination. Over time, many companies move the Canadian rules into the main text so that managers do not have to constantly flip between documents. But the idea is the same: global spine, local muscles. Training US managers who supervise Canadians. A big hidden risk is US managers who supervise Canadian employees while only knowing US rules. They may rely on at-will instincts, verbally promise things that clash with Canadian law, or apply US disciplinary steps that ignore local termination and accommodation standards. It is not enough to fix the text of your policies. You also have to train managers that this is how we do it in the States is not always safe north of the border. Short, focused training that explains the big differences goes a long way toward making your adapted policies actually work in practice. Final thoughts. US HR policies are not automatically valid in Canada. They are only useful to the extent they are re-anchored on Canadian concepts. Notice instead of at will, statutory minimums instead of pure company discretion, stronger privacy and harassment protections, and different rules on leave and accommodation. The structure of your US policies can often be reused, but the legal assumptions underneath have to change. If you treat Canada as just another state in your HR manual, you will eventually pay for that mistake. If you want help turning a US handbook into a version that actually fits Canadian law while keeping your overall culture intact, you can explore more detailed breakdowns at www.theaccountingandtax.com. If you require assistance with Canadian tax matters, our team is ready to provide reliable professional support. Please contact us at 416-283-8774 or visit theaccountingandtax.com for more information. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.